First thing I need a couple to volunteer. Okay, Sergio and Taylor, you guys look like you want to volunteer. Come here. For anybody who doesn't know, Taylor is my niece. Sergio and Taylor are engaged. They're going to be married in just, 8 months almost now? So I want to do a little exercise with them to start us off. Here's what I want you guys to do. I want you to stand. Now come a little closer to each other. Yeah, like that. Okay, put your hands up against each other's hands. Now, I need you to start walking your legs backwards, and as you do, lean your weight on each other more and more until you're at the point where if either of you let go, you would fall. Okay, you feel like, is that good? If I were to smack your arms, you'd fall and hit your face, right? Yeah. Okay, now I got you both. Stand up. No, don't bring your feet back. Don't bring your feet back. Just stand up. Okay. All right, now, here's how most people understand relationships work. Two people come and meet, and they want to connect. And so now what I want you guys to do is I want you to lean back in and have your hands meet, but you can't move your feet. Did you see how tenuous that was? Did you see? But that's how we think relationships go. This is, the ideal relationship, right? You're both equally leaning on each other. You might get tired of this leaning, but it's helping you stay up. But what happened there? Taylor watched Sergio. How much is he leaning? And then he watched her, and did you see the slow incremental lean? And then neither of them put their full back into it until their hands were touching. And then it's like, okay, I can trust them maybe. They wouldn't let me fall in front of the whole church kind of thing. Okay, you guys can let go. You're getting tired. All right, go and sit down. I might bring you back. That's how we understand relationships to work. Two people meet, and they begin to just feel each other out to figure out how much can I lean on you. And if you lean in, then I lean in. And then when I lean in, then you lean in. And we respond to each other in this, what becomes oftentimes a transactional relationship. You give me this much, okay, now I can give you that much. And sometimes those of you who are married know this, and today's gonna be all about marriage. Next week, we're gonna talk singleness. The week after, we're gonna talk family, I think, and then we're gonna talk friendships. But today, we're gonna talk marriage, right? And the way it typically goes is one person often leans, the other pulls back, and we end up in this game. And what seems like wisdom in our world today is this. It seems like wisdom to say, never lean out so much that you can't get back on your own or stand on your own 2 feet if the other person falls on you. Never put that much weight on another person. That's the wisdom of our world today. That's what people would tell you about marriage. Always make sure you're standing on your own 2 feet. Sign that prenup. Make sure you don't extend yourself beyond how they're extending themselves. That's what goes for wisdom. Today, I want to explain to you why that's wrong. I want to show you what foolish marriage looks like and why it works. So turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're going through parts of this letter over these weeks to learn what we started last week about what it means to live out the gospel in our relationships. We said last week, the gospel is not something that you believe one day and now you're saved and get to go to heaven. The gospel is a way of life. It is a way to live that is shaped the way Jesus was shaped, with this selfless sacrificial love. So go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And in this chapter, Paul is going to answer something that they wrote to him about. They wrote him a letter. We don't have the letter they wrote. We pieced together what they said based on what his response is. But we get right in verse 1. If you're there in our app, you can follow along and take notes, or on the screen, or open your own Bible and look at this. It says in verse 1, now for the matters you wrote about, and then he quotes them, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Whoa, what? Who would write that? Here's why they wrote that. Here's what was going on there. The Corinthians, in particular, were obsessed with being spiritual. That was their goal. And they had adopted a philosophy that wasn't biblical. It's actually a philosophy that's still adopted by many Christians today. And that philosophy was that the body is unspiritual and just a husk that needs to be shed. And when we die, the body gets shed and just the spirit goes and lives on. And so that led some of them to conclude along with many other people who weren't Christians in the day, that the body then is therefore unspiritual. The appetites of the body, like sex, are unspiritual. They get in the way of your spirit, so they should be shunned as best as possible here so that you can begin to elevate yourself and become more and more spiritual. That's how many of them believed and thought in that day. But there was another side to that coin too. There were others who said, oh, the body just gets shed like a husk when we die, so it doesn't matter what we do with our bodies. And so they would fulfill the appetites of their bodies in whatever ways they could find, because in their perspective, it didn't matter. We're going to leave it behind, and we're going to graduate out of them. And so they didn't care. And Paul looks at all of them and says, no, that is not what God says about your body. God does not say that your body is some temporary husk. What you do with your body matters. And your body is not some obstacle to spirituality. What we do with our bodies is going to be an act of worship to God. And so this is what he writes about marriage to them. In verse 2, he says, you think, oh, we should avoid sexual relationships. And the married people were writing this to him. And he says, no, that's not true. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital responsibilities to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. I think the phrase, since sexual immorality is occurring, is one of the funniest things I've read in Scripture. Because here's what was actually happening there in Corinth. What you had was couples where one adopted the whole, oh, these bodies are unspiritual, they're not part of the future, so let's do everything to deny those appetites. Forget sex, because that just pollutes our spirit from being really spiritual. And then you have the other member of that same marriage saying, well, no, it doesn't matter what we do with our bodies, so we should just do whatever feels good. And then you put those two together, and guess what that's going to lead to? It's going to lead to all kinds of conflict. And so we dropped into this letter in the middle. We dropped in at the beginning of chapter 7. I want to take you back to chapter 6, to what Paul just said to them before he takes up the marriage question. Go back to chapter 6, verse 12. And here again, Paul starts by quoting them. They say, I have the right to do anything. Paul says, you say that. But not everything's beneficial, he tells them. I have the right to do anything, they say. But I will not be mastered by anything. You say the food's for the stomach and the stomach becomes food. Basically, it all just becomes a cycle of life, right? And God's going to destroy them both. Then Paul corrects and says, no, this body is not meant for sexual immorality. It's meant for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And now here's Paul's argument about why the body, your body, my body, matters. And is not something to just think of as, oh, we'll get rid of it one day and it doesn't matter what I do with it now. Or it's in the way of being spiritual now. He says this, verse 14. By his power, God raised the Lord bodily from the dead, and he will raise us also. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that those who unite themselves with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said the two will become one flesh. But whoever's united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. Oh, okay, so here's what's going on then there. Here's what we piece together. Frustrated, in particular, it sounds like husbands, frustrated by their spiritual wives, were going back to the pagan temples they had been part of in the past. And part of pagan temple worship was prostitution and sleeping with prostitutes. And so they were going back and doing that. And to justify it, because you know how we're all able to figure out excuses to justify doing the things we actually want to do, right? So to justify it, they said, well, it doesn't matter what we do with our body because, the body's just going to fall apart and be gone when we die, and we're just going to be spirits. So it doesn't matter what we do. That was their justification. But Paul countered and said, well, then why was Jesus when he resurrected? Why was his body raised from the grave? He didn't come out a floating spirit only. His body was resurrected. And so he says, your body matters. We don't believe that our destiny is to go one day become disembodied spirits floating around heaven playing harps. That's not what we believe. What we believe is that our bodies will be transformed and we'd be part of a new creation. That's what Scripture teaches. And so what we do with our bodies, including how we behave sexually, matters to God. God gave you that body. And if you're a Christian, then you come to understand your body is part of Christ. And do you really, like he says, do you really want to connect Christ to prostitutes, whether they be in a temple or on a street or on the internet? Do you really want to connect Christ to that behavior? What you do with your body matters to God. And this is all going to connect to marriage in a minute. But first, let Paul just put the final couple nails in his argument there about why our bodies and what we do with them matters. He says in verse 18, run away from sexual immorality. Run away from that stuff because it holds you prisoner. And he says, all other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who's in you, whom you have received from God? And now listen to this next thing Paul says, because this is the foundation of everything we're going to say about foolish marriage right here, this next verse. You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. In other words, Jesus leaned in all the way, and we didn't meet him in the middle. And so he crashed, and he died for us. He laid down his life to create a bridge for us so that we could escape our slavery to sin and these appetites, slavery to them, not to get away from them entirely. God gave us these appetites, they're good, but we could escape slavery to them and slavery to sin. Jesus bought us out of slavery to sin in these bodies. So now our body belongs to the Lord. The gospel is that Jesus gave his body for you and me. So now let's you and I give our bodies to him. And now Paul's going to take that beautiful truth of what Jesus did for us, how he just let himself fall all the way. He leaned all the way in to make a way for you and I to be able to escape slavery to sin and truly love. And he's going to apply that to marriage. So look back at 1 Corinthians 7, verse 4, and listen to what he writes. He says, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but gives it, yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Now, something shifted inside some of you when I read that. If you were listening, some of you, all of a sudden, that picture that sounded so beautiful, and when it's Jesus hanging on the cross, leaning out there for you and me, letting himself die so that you and I could be set free, that kind of leaning in love sounded amazing and beautiful when it was Jesus doing it. But now when he says that's what marriage should look like too, that you give yourself completely to that other person, that doesn't sound as attractive. It sounds wrong. It sounds foolish. Go post that somewhere on social media today. Just go post that verse and see what responses you get from people. See what people say to that. Especially in a culture where my body, my choice is our slogan. That's the kind of world we're in. How do you think that plays? And why? I understand why it doesn't play well. I think it should make sense to us why it doesn't play well. Why God's wisdom sounds foolish to us. It sounds foolish because what we all see is a corrupt, broken, twisted world where corrupt, broken, twisted people like you and me twist and manipulate and take advantage of other people any chance we get. And so that kind of self-giving, lay myself down, give my body to another person, they have authority over it? That just doesn't make sense in that kind of a world, if that's my starting point. I mean, look, let's be honest. Let's be honest with ourselves. Even though Jesus did that for you and me, we still struggle to do that back, to give him ourselves back, to give our bodies to him. Why in the world would you want to yield? If you struggle to do it with Jesus, why in the world would you want to yield your body, give yourself that way to a husband who maybe is not even close to being like Jesus, or a wife who's not even close to being like Jesus? They're not even close to having done for you what Jesus did. Why should you do this for them? And the reason it sounds so foolish is this. Because when we apply it to our marriages, we forget to bring across the starting point that Paul started with here. We forget to bring across the starting point of the gospel. We make our spouse the new starting point. And so I lean in as much as they lean in. And as much as they deserve my body, I give to them. And then as little as they deserve, that's what they get. Because we make each other the starting point. That's not Paul's starting point here. Paul's starting point is Jesus. His starting point is start with your connection to Jesus. The same way Jesus gave his body for the church and expects the church to give herself to him, husbands give their bodies to their wives, and wives give their bodies to their husbands. Not because, husbands, don't give your bodies to your wives because of your wives and what they've done. Wives, don't give your body to your husband because of your husband and what he's done to earn it, deserve it, show that he's got mutual trust. Do it because of Jesus. Not because of the way they're leaning in, but because of the way Jesus leaned in. We need a new start. Sergio Taylor, come back here. Here's what this looks like. We need a new starting point. If we're going to be able to lean in, if we're going to live foolish marriage the way Paul's laying it out here in the Bible, we need to have a different starting point for the way we lean in. So, all right, Taylor, you just stand right on that blue line. Sergio, come over here, stand in front of me. Now, in this scenario, Sergio, Taylor's Taylor, and I'm going to play the part of Jesus. I know that's a stretch, but I'm going to play the part of Jesus. So, Taylor, you can back up a little bit. Yeah, start leaning out, Sergio. Put your hands out. All right, Taylor, now I want you to lean in. And go ahead, lean in. Isn't it much easier to make contact when he's already leaned all the way? Like, that was much easier to do. Because if you're leaning on Jesus and Jesus has Sergio, right? Taylor, now lean your weight away a little bit and take your hands away a little bit. Now, Sergio was like a normal person living normal wisdom. Sergio, what would you do? You'd pull your hands back because she's not leaning in as much. So now the gap's bigger. But because Jesus is holding him, Sergio, go ahead and lean. He can close that gap. You see, he can lean more because it doesn't matter that she's pulled back. He can lean because Jesus has got him. Taylor, walk away. No. That's a hard moment in marriage right there. That's a hard moment, isn't it? That the person starts to walk away. But he can still lean. He can still lean in because Jesus has got him. This shouldn't go on forever where the other person walks away, but he can lean in without resentment, without worrying about, I'm not being loved back. I'm not getting back what I'm giving because Jesus is giving him everything he needs. Now, come back up. Taylor, come back over here. One other way to look at this, don't come too close. One other way to look at this is this. It's not just that Jesus has you. It's that Jesus did this. He fell into that chasm that we worry about falling into. So that now, even if you fall over, you don't fall into that chasm because Jesus laid his life down. That's what Jesus does for us. Those things, guys, thank you. Do you see what Paul's trying to lay out for us about this foolish marriage? It's not easy. No one's ever going to say it is. But when both of you have Jesus as your anchor, can you just imagine what that will do in your relationship? Married people, do you see what that'll do in your relationship? It'll enable you to shine the foolish light of the gospel into everyone else's relationships and let them see it. Now, take a moment, though. Would you just sit back and listen to what Paul said? Because I think it's easy for you and I to miss it, especially in our world and in our culture and in our environment where there's been just so much that's gone on that's been wrong. But see how Paul makes this so mutual? There's mutual submission. There's mutual surrender. There's mutual desire and need. Sex is a valid appetite in both men and women. And Paul, 2,000 years ago, the Bible, which some people think is backwards and doesn't get it, is holding this up as, yes, this is good and this is right. And it's true, though. Someone who doesn't start with Jesus could go home today and say to their wife, hey, did you hear what the Bible says? It says, your body's mine. And your wife could respond and say, yes, I did hear that, honey. And I also heard the Bible say that your body's mine. So I'll tell you what you want and when you want it. But that kind of conversation will never happen in a marriage where two people's starting point is the gospel and what Jesus did for them. Because Jesus never steps in and manipulates us into loving him and returning and giving ourselves to him. There is no manipulation in it. There is only selfless, self-giving love. That's what Jesus enables us to do, because that's what Jesus did for us. These verses are not permission to manipulate, as some have used them to do. They're an invitation to emulate selfless, self-giving love toward your spouse. Now listen, some of you are the only one in your marriage tied to Jesus. And that's not easy. In church, we need to be aware and pray for our brothers and sisters who are in that situation. But Paul goes on to say that your love toward your unbelieving spouse makes a real difference in their lives. Whether you see it or not, God sees your marriage as set apart to him because of you. And the way you love is going to be a witness to your spouse. And when you're tired, remember who's holding you. When you feel like maybe you're going to fall into a chasm, remember who filled that chasm and made that bridge so that can't happen. And then let me say this, because I know we live in a broken world, and some of you might be in marriages where abuse is going on. Being anchored in Jesus does not mean that he expects you and I to lean into abuse, into dangerous abuse. It means he can give you the strength to acknowledge and escape that abuse, to call it what it is without having to be consumed with bitterness and rage and anger, or get to the point where you just build up enough hate to actually do something about it. That's what it means. If you or anyone you know are in a situation like that or recovering from a situation like that, I just want to this morning put up, there's a wonderful group called Hagar Sisters that's local. There's one, I think, in Lexington and one in Beverly. Women who gather, in particular, I believe it's women, to help each other work through issues related to domestic abuse. Write that name down. Go look it up on the internet today if you or someone you know is going through something like that or has been through something like that. Don't just sit there and suffer alone. That's not what Jesus calls you to do. Jesus doesn't call you to lean into being dangerously abused. Jesus does, though, give you the strength to call it what it is and not let bitterness consume you in the midst of that. And then lastly, listen, every marriage is going to struggle. There's not a single married person in this room who could truthfully say, oh no, marriage is never a struggle. Marriage is a constant struggle. Marriage will not make serving God easier either. Because you might think, oh, we're both Christians, so marriage, this should be great. No, it's still really hard, and then you feel bad that it's hard because, hey, we're Christians, why can't we do this better? It's hard enough to follow Jesus as a single person. When you bring another fallen person in, it doesn't make things easier. Hopefully, though, you and I can appreciate how difficult this standard of marriage is that Paul is holding up. And see, this is what God's calling us to. And so what we need to do is also normalize asking for help, because every married couple goes through it. Every married couple struggles. And so can we just normalize asking for help? Whether it's come to me and ask for help, I will try and connect you with a counselor. And I know some of you know there's long waiting lists right now. That's fine. Don't give up. But let's get you connected to someone who can help you work through the rough spots in your marriage and learn to lean on Jesus more. Can we do that? I'm going to ask all the married people to stand up and come to the front. This is how we're going to end this morning. So all the married people, whether your spouse is here or not, if you're a married person, come stand in the front with me. Just spread out all around here. And then I want you to listen to me. And worship team, you guys can make your way back up here. We're going to close with a song in a few moments, but I want you to listen to me. Because you belong to Jesus, you can lean into each other. Keep making room, let everybody get in. Your marriages are not a balancing act of, making sure the other person's putting in the same amount of lean as you are. No, because of Jesus, it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to ride the waves where today you just aren't good at leaning. It doesn't have to ride those waves and then the other pulls back and then you pull back more. It doesn't have to be that way. You lean because of Jesus. You're always watching him. That's what foolish marriage is about. And then one last thing to remember as we get ready to sing the song. And it's a song you don't know, but we're going to sing it as a prayer. I'm going to invite you to sing it as a prayer. And the pronouns on here will be, my, but make them our. And married people, think about your marriage. Everyone else in our church, sing this as a prayer when we get to it for married people too. I want you to think about this. The same God who used Adam and Eve in spite of their failures and brokenness is the God who will give you the strength you need. The same God who helped Abraham and Sarah in spite of their crazy failures. Do you remember some of the stuff we learned about Abraham? He gave Sarah up like, oh no, she's my sister. You can have her as your wife. Like crazy stuff they did wrong. God still worked through them and used them and did amazing things through them. Think about Mary and Joseph, the fear of that young girl and the worry of that man. And in spite of their own humility and weakness, God worked through them to do amazing things. He's the same God who will work through your marriage if you just lean on him and know that he's holding you, and so you lean in.